My name is Guy Cook. I've recently retired. My last job was at King's College London, and I've been an academic since 1985. And before that, I was an English language teacher in various places. I was a teacher. I wanted to do something else. I went to do an MA in London with Henry Widdowson and Christopher Brumfitt, which inspired me to be interested in the academic side of applied linguistics. I've been rather a generalist. I continue to do work on language teaching and what linguistics has to offer to language teaching, applied linguistics has to offer to language teaching. But I've also done work in very different areas as well. I've done work on the language of food politics, and just recently I finished a project on the way that people talk and write about animals. So I have a particular interest in language teaching and applied linguistics. That's been my kind of bread and butter, really. But I've branched out into other areas as well. I don't think people can measure their influence, and I don't think academic influences on language teaching last very long either. So I really don't know. I've done some work arguing for the reintroduction of translation in language teaching and against monolingual English language teaching. So I've been rather strongly against the notion of teaching English only through the medium of English. And I'd like to think that that's had an influence on people. I think there's a general current in English language teaching now towards that, because it seems very chauvinistic to do everything through English and exclude people's other language identities. I've found that people have responded rather positively to that argument, actually, but I think that's because many English language teachers in the world, especially non-native English speaker teachers, have felt in their heart of hearts that the best way to teach a language is by connecting it to the student's existing language, and translation is a useful thing. So I hope I've had a little bit of influence in that. I published a book in 2010 called Translation and Language Teaching, which was quite successful in academic terms. But as I say, I think it's more eliciting a response from people who already feel that way. So I don't think I've had a major influence in that way. I think language teaching and language learning happens anyway. People have always done it, and have always done it quite successfully, especially if they're motivated. So one of my arguments has been that although the academic study of language learning and language teaching is very interesting, I'm not sure that it's essential to good language learning and good teaching. So one of the things I would like to think I've done is to encourage language teachers to realise that they can do it anyway and not to be subject to changing fashions in the academic world. There was another area that I was very interested in quite a while ago now, which is non-practical functions of language. So the way that people play with language and enjoy playing with language, and this attracts them. This focuses upon the forms of language in a very natural and enjoyable way. And again, I was very opposed to some of the things that academics were saying people shouldn't be doing, like learning things by heart, playing games, showing interest in the forms of language. So I'd like to think I've always been a bit of a rebel as far as the fashionable applied linguistics influences on language teaching have been. Yeah. On the subject of whether my work has influenced the way that language teachers practice their profession, I think it's very tempting for academics to be rather full of themselves and arrogant about these kind of things. So I could certainly pick out things which seem to be in tune with things that I've said. But I think the most important thing in language teaching is actually for teachers to be more autonomous and more independent of academic thought. I think applied linguistics is interesting in itself. It's interesting to study how people teach and learn languages from a theoretical and empirical point of view. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily should be the major influence on what people actually do. There's an important difference here. And I think as far as studying applied linguistics goes for language teachers, which many language teachers want to do, it should also be seen as an end in itself. It's intellectually enriching, it expands one's horizons, It gives one a general, deeper sense of what language use and language teaching and learning are about. To think that it must always have some practical spin-off is not necessarily the best way of thinking, in my opinion. Well, I think for language teachers to become interested in applied linguistics and what motivates them to do that, I think approach with an open mind. I think one of the problems in applied linguistics and its influence on language teaching has been the notion of immediate payoff. In fact, I have a rather unconventional point of view, which is I think a lot of academic study of language teaching and learning has done quite a lot of harm. So I mentioned earlier on the outlawing of translation and indeed the outlawing of using students' own languages in the classroom, which I'm afraid to say came from mainstream applied linguistics from 1960s onwards or even earlier, certainly in the 70s and 80s. And I don't think that was a very good thing to have happened. So in some ways, applied linguistics would be better if it saw itself as an academic subject from which language teachers can draw things which are useful and from which language teachers can benefit in a very general way. I think education's become far too utilitarian and focused too much on practical offshoots and so on and so forth. But I would encourage language teachers to study applied linguistics because it's a very interesting subject in itself. And maybe by studying it, they can become more resistant to some of the fashions which have plagued language teaching for the last 40 or 50 years. And they can see good reasons to say, well, okay, you say that, but I know how to do it better. Well, in terms of what language teachers might read about applied linguistics, if they are interested, they feel they might be interested and go on to study it academically and find out more about it, I would recommend still, although they are, many of them published still some time ago, the works of Henry Widdowson, who I think has been one of the most inspiring and thoughtful theorists of applied linguistics, and also has a very beautiful style to read, which can't be said of many applied linguists, I'm afraid. And if I could be a little bit egocentric, I would thoroughly recommend a book by me, of course, which is a textbook called Applied Linguistics, which was published in the Oxford Introductions to Language series in 2003, I think. And I hope that that would form some kind of introduction to the field as a whole, not only to applied linguistics and language teaching, but to the range of issues relating to language use in society. I think this is a very interesting time in applied linguistics because applied linguistics has become concerned with many areas beyond language teaching and learning, sometimes with the danger that it splits up and loses its identity. But one of the reasons that applied linguistics is particularly important at the moment, in a way this has always been the case in the world, but it's particularly salient at the moment, is because of the resurgence of very narrow nationalism and people's focus upon their own kind to the exclusion of other kinds. We've seen this with Trump, and we've seen it with Brexit, and we see it in Turkey, and we see it in many places around the world, and in the resurgence of various right-wing nationalist movements in all sorts of places. And language teaching and learning, and translation too, actually, has always been one of the great bastions against this kind of thinking, because it introduces people to other ways of thinking than their own. So I think that now this is a particularly important time for people to keep on considering how one can relate to other people's languages and other people's beliefs and other ways of doing things. And that's why language teaching and learning and applied linguistics are particularly important enterprises in the world today.